Today I'm going to be introducing you to the fundamentals of CSS. Previously you learned how to write HTML that describes how a web page is structured, and now you get to give it some style. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. The focus of this today I'm going to be introducing you to the fundamentals of CSS. Previously you learned how to write HTML that describes how a web page is structured, and now you get to give it some style. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. The focus of this lesson will be on CSS syntax and selectors. You'll be learning about the power of the cascade in an upcoming lesson. So let's begin with our first style here. When we group styles like this together, it's known as a rule set or rule. Each CSS rule is composed of three parts. The selector here, this is the piece of HTML you want to attach the style to. The property here, which is the characteristic that you'd like to update, and the value here, which is what you are updating the property to become. In this rule, we're grabbing all divs with a class of bold text and setting the font weight of everything contained within them to 700. Font weight also takes keywords, so we could use the value bold here instead. Together, the property value pair is called a declaration, and we can add a number of these to the rule. For example, we could add a color to the text inside this div, and we could add a height to the div. You'll notice that each declaration is separated by a semicolon. Now we have a handle on the basic syntax. Let's take a closer look at selectors. I have a page here that contains a number of elements, which together we're going to style. We have divs, images, heading levels 1 and 2, list items, sections, and even links. And we can see that they all come together in our page, which we can view here in our mini browser. The first selector we're going to use is the universal selector, which selects everything on the page. And we call this by typing an asterisk. Here we're going to set the line height to 1.5. The next selector we're going to use is the type selector, which will select all elements of the given element type. We're going to use it on the body element like so. And we're going to change the font family. Now if we save that and we load our mini browser, you can see that those changes have taken effect. The line height has given our text a little more breathing room. At this point, I want to let you know that this screencast is interactive. So if you pause now, you can edit the code directly here. Then press Run in the top right to view your changes in the mini browser. Now I'd like you to practice your CSS skills by using the type selector to add in rules for the following. I want you to set the image width to 200 pixels, the list style of the UL element to none, and add a dark red color to the H1. If you don't know how to set the list style, just Google it. Once you've done this challenge, press play and I'll take you through my solution. Okay, go ahead and see if you can make those changes. I hope you enjoyed using your newly acquired CSS powers to style this page. Let's work through them together. First, we're going to use the type selector to grab our image on the page, and we're going to give this a width. Next, we're going to set the list style of our UL to none, and we use the property list style, and we set none. Then we're going to add a color of dark red to our heading. Here I've used a keyword, but you could have used a hex value if you prefer. We'll save those changes, and then if we load in the mini browser, we can see that our heading has a dark red color. The bullets on our list have disappeared, and our image is now much smaller at 200 pixels. The next selector we're going to look at is one you'll find yourself writing again and again. It's the class selector. A CSS class is an attribute used to define a group of HTML elements in order to apply unique styling and formatting to those elements with CSS. We use this by adding a dot or period before the class name. If you look in the HTML, you can see we've already added classes to the page. For example, we have this container class, this recipe card class, and this recipe content class. These are just HTML attributes like any other. I'm going to target this recipe card class in our CSS and give it a width of 400 pixels. And we can see that change here. It's time for your next challenge. I'd like you to add the text align and background properties to this rule set. Do you remember how we separate declarations? Then I'd like you to create a new rule for the recipe content class and give it a text align of left. Pause the screencast to make those changes and then press play when you're done, and we'll go through the code together. Okay, so let's add in our new styles like so. We need to use a semicolon to separate our declarations. Now we're going to add a new rule for the recipe content class. And we're going to give this a text align of left. Here we're overriding the text align property that we've previously set on the recipe card, which is itself a parent element. But we'll learn a little more about that later. Let's have a look at these changes. You're not limited to one class per element. If we look in the HTML here, we can see that our recipe card also has a class of feature. If you add more than one class to an element, you must separate each with a space. We can see that our record at these changes also has a class of feature. If you add more than one class per element, if you learn a little more about that later. Let's have a look at these changes. You're not limited to one class per element. If we look in the HTML here, we can see that our recipe card also has a class of feature. If you add more than one class to an element, you must separate each with a space. Now it's time to look at ID selectors. Here we have an ID of container on our div element. If we want to target this in our CSS, we simply add a hash and then the name of the ID. Here we'll set a border so we can see the style in play. And you can see it's added a border to the container which wraps all of our content. Unlike a class, an ID must be unique, and each element may only have one ID. We tend to reserve IDs for targeting elements in the JavaScript. It's ill-advised to use IDs for styling, so let's remove this rule from our style sheet. Now we're going to look at different ways we can use selectors in combination. I realise at this point we've covered a lot of ground, so don't worry if this all feels very unfamiliar. As you become more confident with CSS, this knowledge will become second nature. But for now, it's just good for you to know that these various selectors exist. Okay, the first way we can use selectors in combination is by grouping selectors. Here we're going to apply a text style of uppercase to the link element and our H2 elements. And if we look in our design, we can see our H2 elements here and our link here. When we group selectors, we separate each selector in our grouping with a comma. And we can see our styles have been applied. We can also chain selectors. Remember in our HTML, we saw that our recipe card had a second class of feature. Well, we can use this to our advantage. I'm now going to add a style for all recipe cards which also contain the class of feature by chaining these classes together. And this style here with two class names with no space between them applies to all elements which have both a class of recipe card and a class of feature. And if we save this, we can see that it has wrapped around our recipe card. I'm going to change this color to dark red for now. We can also use the descendant combinator to style our pages. If we go to our HTML, we can see some elements sit inside of others. For example, the image here sits inside a div with a class of recipe card, which itself sits inside another div with a class of container. Let's look at how we target descendants in CSS. You can see in this rule here that we're targeting both H2 and A elements and setting their text to be uppercase, when in fact we only want to target headings and links which sit inside the recipe card container, or the div with the class of recipe card. If we add recipe card to the beginning of both selectors, like so, it will select only links and H2s that are inside or descendants of an element with the class of recipe card. In this way, we can limit the scope of our rules from affecting other elements on the page. I have a final challenge for you. I want you to add a font size of 16 pixels to all H2s which are a descendant of both a UL and an LI element. Then I want you to add some more styles to our recipe card links, and I've outlined these here. I want you to change the background color, add a text color, and remove the underline. You may need to do a little Googling to find out how you achieve this last one. Pause the screencast, and I'll give you a moment to complete the challenge. Okay, hopefully you were able to work through those without much difficulty. You'll need to use the descendant selector for the H2 element like so. Then you'll need to add a new rule for the link because we don't want to affect the H2 element which we selected with this group. Okay, hopefully you were able to work through those without much difficulty. You'll need to use the descendant selector for the H2 element like so. Then you'll need to add a new rule for the link because we don't want to affect the H2 element which we've selected with this group selector here. And we're going to update the background color, the text color. Here I'm using the hex value for white and remove the underline. You do this by setting the text decoration property. And we can see we now have a slightly off-white background and we have removed the text decoration and added a background color for our link. If you've been having any difficulty getting the right syntax for these challenges, you can use the built-in code completion in the editor. And don't be scared to look at the documentation or search for things. There are so many CSS properties, with more being added to the specification, so you're not expected to commit them all to memory. Okay, that's it. All our styles are done and our page is updated. You can see how with relatively few lines of CSS, we've made the content much easier to read and understand. You might have noticed that even though we haven't added any margins or paddings explicitly, there are some gaps between our elements. For example, our headings and our list items. This is because certain HTML elements have default padding and margin built in. We'll learn about how to override these styles in a later lesson. But first, we're going to take a quick look at where we place our CSS. At the moment, you can see that all our CSS is placed in a separate file with an extension of .css. This is referenced from our HTML page with a link tag inside our head, like so. We call this external CSS, and it's the most common method of adding CSS to HTML, but it's not the only one. We can also add our CSS internally by placing the same styles inside a style tag contained in the HTML head. Here I've opened and closed my style block. I'm going to take some of these styles and cut them from my external style sheet, then paste them into my internal style block. If we save this, we can see that the design is unchanged. This is because our page is taking styles from both the external and the internal style sheet and applying them. The disadvantage of this approach is that these styles only apply to the page they're on. It means if we're sharing styles between pages, we need to update them in multiple locations. The final way of adding CSS to a page is by writing inline CSS. We add styles directly to our HTML via a style attribute. Let's add some styles to our container. Since we're attaching the styles, we can omit the selector and just add a list of declarations. So let's add another declaration here. And you can see both of those styles have applied to our page. It's not recommended to write CSS this way, so I'm going to remove it. And that's because you can't take advantage of grouping selectors, so you need to write styles out for each element. It can also become very difficult to maintain when styles need to be updated. Finally, styles written inline override any style set in external and internal style sheets, which can cause unexpected results. The algorithm that browsers use to combine property values from different sources to determine which style wins is called the cascade, and that's what we'll be taking a look at next. Usually take advantage of grouping selectors, so you need to write styles out for each element. It can also become very difficult to maintain when styles need to be updated. Finally, styles written inline override any style set in external and internal style sheets, which can cause unexpected results. The algorithm that browsers use to combine property values from different sources to determine which style wins is called the cascade, and that's what we'll be taking a look at. The algorithm that browsers use to combine inline override any style set in external and internal style sheets, which can cause unexpected results. The algorithm that browsers use to combine property values from different sources to determine which style wins is called the cascade, and that's what we'll be taking a look at next.